After getting appropriate sunlight, controlling light, eating enough, balancing your macros, removing linoleic acid. By the way, if none of that makes sense, go back and watch those videos, because each one of these videos is gonna build off of the previous one. After all of that, the next layer to look at are your micronutrient intakes. And so when I say micronutrients, I'm referring to vitamins, water soluble and fat soluble. I'm referring to macro minerals. These are the ones that you need higher amounts of, trace minerals, and getting as much of that from your food as possible. It's important to understand the differences between these and these like subcategories of vitamins and minerals, where they come from, and some of the benefits of getting them. And I think it's also really important that we try to get as much of them from food as possible. And not all food are equal. So there are differences which really depend on farming that determine the nutritional content, the micronutrient content of different foods. And it's probably the last thing that we're going to talk about today is using a tool that can help you track these things, at least initially, until you have a diet set up as your sort of main macro and micro intake throughout the day, as I was talking about in the last video. So let's get started. This table shows you all of the vitamins. Shows you whether they are water soluble or fat soluble. And it also gives you the highest food source of these vitamins. In some cases, for example, like with vitamin E, highest food source is going to come from a seed. So I've eliminated seeds because of the polyunsaturated fat content of those seeds being a net negative for taking that food just to get the vitamin E. So instead of that, we replaced it with something like Atlantic salmon as a source for vitamin E. So in other words, these are the highest food sources of low PUFA foods, essentially. Low linoleic acid foods is a better way of saying it. Because some of these things actually do have omega-3 content, which are polyunsaturated fats. And so let's just talk about the two categories of water and fat soluble. So water soluble is basically what it sounds like. These are vitamins that dissolve in water, and they will get excreted if they're not absorbed or they're not used. And so that is predominantly going to come out in the urine. Fat-soluble vitamins can only be dissolved in fats or carried in fats, and they will store in your body. They will store in your adipose tissue. And so that's important because, some people are over-supplementing some things, and also, it helps you understand that because over-supplementing will cause those vitamins to accumulate. The other thing to understand is that in some cases, like for example with vitamin D, the idea is you're not going to get the majority of your vitamin D from cod liver oil. You're going to get it from making it with UVB exposure from the sunlight. And the idea is that if you live in a higher latitude where you go into a vitamin D winter, that you are producing it during the high vitamin D months, and then you are storing it for use in the wintertime. So when there is vitamin D making ability, so you have UVB time, you're getting exposure to prepare, essentially sort of prepare your body for the vitamin D winter when it goes away. So I think what's important here is to just kind of share with you some of the most common deficiencies that I see through testing or through monitoring someone's dietary intake with a tool like Cronometer, where they enter in their food intake over a 3-day period, and then we just do an assessment of the micronutrients to see what they're missing. These are the most common ones that I see. And so a very common one is vitamin B1, otherwise known as thiamine. And thiamine is the rate-limiting cofactor for essentially breaking glucose down into pyruvate with the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. And so this happens inside the cell, but outside the mitochondria. It's essentially preparing glucose to be converted into a substrate that can enter into the mitochondria. This is more critical for someone who's on a higher carb diet. And that's essentially what we're teaching, is to go on a higher carb diet relative to fat, because it can be deficient in someone's diet. And typically you would see it in grains or in pork. So if you're not eating those things, then it's very possible that you are deficient in B1. And this can manifest in a lot of different ways. There's a well-known researcher, Dr. Lonsdale, that wrote a book on dysautonomia that was basically tracing the functionality of neurons, whether in this case, peripheral neurons, vagus nerve, this kind of thing, to functional B1 deficiency. And when he was treating people with B1, there was remarkable improvements, specifically in the gut, but also with regard to neurocardiac improvements, also with regard to gut-brain axis and neurotransmitter handling as well. So this may be one that you want to focus on. Another one is B2, otherwise known as riboflavin. And this vitamin is critical for all of the macronutrient utilizations. It's critical for activating other B vitamins like B3, 6, and B9. And it is also a cofactor in mitochondrial energy production. The next one that is quite common and also sort of popular to talk about is B9 or folate, and whether or not someone can actually convert folic acid into methylfolate, which is done by the MTHFR enzyme. And so the highest food source of folate and B2, beef liver. Beef liver is basically a multivitamin. Also very high in vitamin A, which is another one that I see as being deficient for people. B9 or folate will impact many different functions because methylation is utilized in many different systems of the body. Next, as I mentioned a little bit before, vitamin A. You can get a form of vitamin A from the plant world, but really getting it pre-formed from animals is the best because that beta carotene needs to be converted, and we have different rates of conversion, and it's not well converted. So there can be problems with overdoing things like carrots in order to get beta carotene. But vitamin A is critical for immune system health, for the epithelial lining health of the immune system on the epithelial lining of all of the respiratory passages from your nose to your lungs, from your mouth to your anus, that basically protect you from the outside world. Also, vitamin D is very common, and this is straight up because people are not exposing their skin to UVB. And so UVB is a very specific time of day. It usually is the narrowest window of the day, midday, and it will change based on latitude throughout the year. You can use apps to figure out the UVB exposure at your location, at your time, which is good to know. But if you're putting sunscreen on, you're not making vitamin D. If you're covering your skin, you're not making vitamin D. And this is critically important, and many people are low in making vitamin D. Vitamin D, outside of the critical use that it has in boosting immune health and its role in supporting sex hormone production, it's critical for calcium handling in the body, and it allows the gut to absorb more calcium and phosphorus, which are needed for bone and teeth mineralization. It also helps to dampen indirectly parathyroid hormone, which is involved in basically pulling calcium out of the bones if you're not getting enough or not absorbing enough. So they are sort of oppositional to one another. And then the last vitamin that I see, and also it's a fat-soluble vitamin, being deficient for a lot of people, is K2. And K2 is critical for stimulating the osteoblasts, stimulating the bones to absorb calcium. And so it's a very, very good tool for someone who has soft tissue calcification. Soft tissue calcification can happen for a couple of reasons, but the main one is because a person is not getting enough calcium in their diet and their vitamin D is low. And so the calcium gets pulled out of the bones and then goes into the soft tissue. And so this is what shows up if you get a coronary artery calcium score or scan. So you can actually like scan the aorta and the heart with a CT scanner to look for calcium. And that's what this is. This process is all related to calcium handling and these critical vitamins. So vitamin K2 will actually move the calcium out of the soft tissue and into the bone by the stimulation of the bone cells. Moving on to minerals. First, we're going to talk about macro minerals, and these are called macro minerals because you need them in the highest amount in your diet. What most people don't know is that potassium has the highest RDA or adequate intake value of any mineral. It's significant. It's more than twice the second highest mineral, chloride. So this is the rank order according to the recommended daily allowance of the macro minerals that one needs. And as you can see, chloride and sodium are predominantly coming from table salt. So this is pretty easy to get and pretty easy to dose. Calcium predominantly comes from dairy products. If you're not eating dairy for some reason and you won't try it, it's very important that you look at your overall calcium intake and enter your diet into something like Chronometer so that you can see what your dietary intake is. Because if you're not getting enough, you will trigger this process of the parathyroid hormone activating, which will pull the calcium from the bones. And that's not a good thing for many different reasons, but it is essentially dependent on your dietary calcium, 1,000 to 1,300 milligrams. Next, you've got magnesium and then phosphorus. And so these on their own are quite important. Also, what's important is the relationship between some of these minerals. For example, the relationship between potassium and sodium, the relationship between calcium and magnesium, the relationship between calcium and phosphorus. And these relationships are so critical that they have been studied in mineral balancing for a very long time, for 50 years. You want to be getting roughly 3 times more potassium than sodium in your diet. There are many reasons for this, but here's just a couple. Potassium is the biggest intracellular ion mineral, and sodium is the highest extracellular. So the balance between those essentially helps with the shuttling of nutrients in and out of the cell, as well as the balance of water inside and outside of the cell. If someone is not getting enough potassium relative to sodium, the things that happen are increased blood pressure, increased swelling because there's water retention. Then you've got activation of the adrenal glands, and you've got lowering of thyroid hormone sensitivity. So these are all a result of an imbalance or not enough potassium relative to sodium in your diet. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how some of these minerals are critical for buffering against the toxicity of different heavy metals. But for now, I would just want you to know that what the role of some of these minerals are and why they're critically important. Now, so you go, well, Well, where do you get potassium from? Potassium comes in high amounts from root vegetables, from tubers, and from fruits. Those are excellent sources. They're also it's also in avocado. It's also in coconut water. And so increasing these things relative to how much you're salting your food is critically important. When I do Oligo scans, most of the time, people are getting the perfect amount of salt. They're just under eating potassium. The next important ratio is the calcium to phosphorus ratio. And this, in large part, has to do with that whole calcium regulation system I was talking about before with vitamin D and parathyroid hormone. You want to get like about 1.7 times more calcium than phosphorus in the diet. So this is usually sorted out unless you're restricting some kind of food. For example, you're restricting dairy, but you're eating a lot of meat or you're eating a lot of legumes and beans. So those foods have a lot of phosphorus and they don't have much calcium. And so that can disrupt that ratio, which is going to impair your bone mineral density as well as increase soft tissue calcification. And then another very important ratio is the calcium to magnesium ratio. You want to get about 2.8 times more calcium than magnesium. Most people have a lot more calcium relative to magnesium. In other words, they are deficient in magnesium. This is the ratio, the four main ratios that are taken from the Oligo scan. This is a pretty common profile that I see here, that people are magnesium deficient, so the calcium magnesium ratio is high. People are phosphorus deficient relative to calcium, and so that ratio is high. Almost everybody has a low potassium to sodium ratio. It's rare that I see that it is in a good realm. And then I'll talk about the next ratio as we move into trace minerals. Here's a table rank ordered of trace minerals. And you can see of the trace minerals, zinc, 11 milligrams per day for men, 8 for women, all the way down to lithium, which is about 1 milligram per day. Now, silicon and lithium I included. They're not normally included in this list, but I included them because they're critical for buffering against some of the metals. They tend to be filtered out if you're drinking filtered water. And water is pretty much where most people get them from. So among this list here, iodine, selenium, chromium, silicon, those are the ones on this list that I see the most deficiencies when I do Oligo scans for people. And this will show up in some of the blood proteins that a person might measure. So this you can see the effect of this if you do iron studies with blood markers, transferrin, iron saturation, ferritin, serum iron. You can see the relationship between iron and copper in that ceruloplasmin, serum copper. Some of these are not well measured in blood, like zinc, chromium, silicon. They're predominantly intracellular, so you don't see them much in blood. But it's really important that food sources cover as much of this as possible. And this is a pretty good list for getting these things covered. Getting back to the dietary mineral ratios, the ratio of copper to zinc is also critical. And this probably most notably shows up in two areas. One is somebody that's got high tissue copper, this is unbound copper, will tend to have behavioral disorders. And the other thing that tends to happen is that they've got estrogen dominance. There's a pretty strong correlation between those two things. If we test for estradiol in the blood or low zinc, you will see lower testosterone for men and lower progesterone for women. So optimizing this ratio has a pretty profound effect on sex hormones and on mood. You want to get about 10 times more zinc than copper in your diet. Why aren't we getting enough micronutrients? The common thing that I hear often is that the soil is deficient in minerals, and that's why the plants are deficient and the animals are deficient, and why we are deficient. That the soil has been depleted of minerals. And actually, I disagree with this. I think that the problem with the soil is that it's dead. The problem is that it's devoid or extremely limited in biological life. And I changed my opinion on this after interviewing Elaine Ingham. So you can check out that podcast interview on our channel. And she's a soil microbiologist that essentially teaches farmers how to sample their soil and look for fungi, bacteria, arthropods to determine the diversity and the amount of biological life. Why is this important? It's important because when plants need a mineral, they signal to a fungi or a bacteria to bring them that mineral with something called an exudate. It's basically like a sugar. And they change these different sugars that they produce in the roots to signal which minerals they need. So they're not just getting the minerals directly from the roots, they're getting it through the medium of the mycorrhizal fungi and the bacteria. So if they aren't present, then those minerals cannot be mined and transported to plant roots. And that's the fundamental problem. If those get restored, we always see an increase in the mineral content of plants. And so this gets to the importance of regeneratively farmed or biodynamically farmed food, because the soil is the most important thing that these farmers are looking to improve. And it is a full spectrum improvement. It's improving the microbiome of the soil, which then improves the mineral content available, the bioavailability of minerals for plants, which then goes all the way down the food chain to the animals that are eating those things, whether the animals are eating that grass or the animals are eating plants that we eat. And so regenerative farming are the most nutrient dense plants and animals that you can eat. And so as much as possible, you should be trying to consume those. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about Chronometer. It's the tool I use. There's others out there. You don't have to use it. But basically, this is what it looks like if you fill it out for a day and you are essentially inputting what your breakfast is like, your lunch, your dinner, whatever snacks you eat, miscellaneous things that you eat. You can see the calorie and the macronutrient profile of these foods here, which is relevant for the last video that I mentioned. But in this video, you can also scroll down the page and see the vitamin and mineral content of a specific food or of your entire day. And if you track for 3 days and you're eating normally over that time period, you can see pretty clearly where over time you may develop a deficiency in B2 or deficiency in vitamin E or deficiency in potassium, or why your potassium to sodium ratio may be low, or deficiency in magnesium. This now gets into how do you improve these things? Well, the first thing that you try to do is add foods in that are supplying micronutrients that you're not typically getting. And so, examples of this are like more beef liver, more oysters, more raw milk or butter if you need it. These are pretty nutrient dense things, but in some cases, either you don't like to eat that food, or it's too inconvenient to do it consistently. And that's a pretty good case for supplementing. Another reason that you might supplement is because you have the buildup of these ubiquitous heavy metals in the environment, and you need them for detoxification. Next video will be about this topic. And the other possibility is because you're recovering from a long-term deficiency that is developed into a chronic health issue. And as I mentioned before, B1 is a good example of that, having vagus nerve dysfunction that leads to slower motility that could possibly lead to lower stomach acid and SIBO in the small intestine because of the inability of the neurons in the gut to produce energy from glucose. Hence, vitamin B1 being the rate limiting factor in the process of glycolysis. So these are all possible reasons why you would supplement. And so it's not really about convenience. It's more about necessity, I think, at this point in time, because it's also very difficult to eat 100% regeneratively farmed food. And so with all of these factors together, I do think that supplementing is inevitable. It's unavoidable. It's just a matter of minimizing the amount and finding the right quality supplements to do that. So to recap, we talked about water and fat-soluble vitamins, where to get them from, and typical deficiencies. We talked about macrominerals and microminerals, trace minerals, and typical deficiencies, and where you would get those foods. Regenerative farming and why that's critical. Using Chronometer in order to initially track this to figure out where you might have deficiencies, and then supplementing the difference. So stick around and join me in the next video when I talk about heavy metals and its relationship to minerals.